Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. I love it when topics for the podcast pop into my mind after someone makes what to them seems like a throwaway comment, as it feels extra relevant to talk about, as it's in someone's head. And that's exactly what happened with today's topic. I was in a meeting and another woman there made what felt to her to be a direct comment. And then she stopped herself and said, "Is it okay to say that?" with quite an anxious look on her face. It was a completely private, fairly small meeting with other women who were all there with a shared purpose, but she still had this level of anxiety that she might have put her foot in it. I'm not thinking here about the phenomenon of being cancelled. That's a completely separate topic that I might return to in another episode. What I'm going to be exploring today is the anxiety we feel when we think we might have said something wrong, inappropriate, or we might have hurt someone's feelings inadvertently. Sometimes this feeling can stay with us for several days, or even weeks, as we mull over all the possible ramifications of what we've said. So why do we overthink things? I've done quite a lot of thinking and reading around this topic over the last few days. There's possibly a little bit of parallel process going on here with a bit of overthinking. That's a very poor attempt at a psychodynamic joke. And I've come up with a few theories and ideas around it. Let's start off with some Freud to get us thinking. Freud is the first person to use the term anxiety in relationship to our psychic world. As early as 1895, he's using the term anxiety neurosis, differentiating this from hysteria due to the symptoms that it produces. Very generally speaking, anxiety neurosis produces symptoms that are linked to external objects and can be seen in phobias, whereas hysteria, sometimes known as conversion hysteria, can be seen in a much more somatic expression. Let's look at a couple of examples to make this clearer. We'll start with anxiety neurosis. I really don't enjoy going on aeroplanes. I love travel, and nothing makes me more excited than boarding a Eurostar with one of my very best friends in the world as we go on one of our regular trips to Paris. I could not be happier there. However, put me in an airport and I'll get incredibly nervous, start over-talking and become extremely agitated. I even said to one man that I sat next to on a flight back from the Greek islands once that I was pleased that I was sitting next to him, as he looked a bit like Charlton Heston, and in every disaster film I'd seen, Charlton Heston always gets people out alive. I feel out of control and very frightened. One of my other best friends, who absolutely loved flying, even got us into the cockpit of a plane coming back from Dublin once to help me overcome my fear. You can tell this was some time ago, as it really wouldn't be allowed now. And that worked, until a few days later Concorde blew up. So it's not ever really been my happy place, and it's a fear related to something external. Let's look at the other example, one that we would now refer to as a somatic expression, and in Freud's days would have been described as conversion hysteria. Unfortunately, about 2.5 years ago, my plane-loving friend Steve, who was one of my best friends for over 30 years and one of the most loved people in my world, died. Unsurprisingly, even though I knew it was on the cards, this hit me like a ton of bricks. More surprising to me was the impact that it had on me physically, resulting in a stomach condition, which after much prodding and investigation by the medical system, no complaints there, they ruled out absolutely everything, they diagnosed that it had been induced by stress. You'd think, after all the reading of Freud and other psychodynamic thinkers that I've done over the years, I might understand that the physical symptoms I started to experience after Steve dying were related to this huge loss I was adjusting to. However, it was quite a shock to me when the consultants told me what was going on and wanted to know if I could think of any reason why it might have been brought about. So how does this link in with today's topic? The feeling that we've said something wrong or put our foot in it is very much linked to the first example, something external. However, somewhat confusingly, there's also stuff going on for us internally, in our unconscious minds too. Researching more about Freud's view on how the anxiety neurosis comes about, he sees it very much as linked to his stages of human development. I'm not sure I agree with this wholeheartedly. I think there's probably something to be said for applying it to this area of our lives. But I also like keeping my clean rating under Apple, and I'm not sure I could go into this side of the topic and for it to remain a family show. The mechanism that Freud refers to that I think does apply here is that of psychical working over. A traumatic event happens, and we either process it there and then so that it has no lasting impact on us, or otherwise we bring it into ourselves and it becomes linked in with other associations that are already swimming around our unconsciousness. Freud felt that by bringing these repressed events to the surface, initially using hypnosis and later free association, they could be removed and cause us no further distress. This process was a term called abreaction by Freud and his contemporaries. So what is happening in our example today of being anxious of whether we've said the right thing or not? To use Freud's structure, he would argue that in these cases we're being reminded of a comparable situation where we've not said the right thing. It's caused us trauma in some way or another that we've been unable to work through at the point of origin, and we've then integrated these difficult feelings into us. They get mixed in with all other kinds of repressed materials swimming about in our unconscious and then come back to haunt us in these moments where we have similar feelings. We can also link this to the repetition compulsion, where we seek out experiences to relive previous traumatic events with the unconscious hope of repairing the initial trauma. Whilst that isn't entirely a carbon copy of today's example, what it does show is that the mind can retain things that it wants to process if it hasn't dealt with them in the most effective way. When we get worried that we haven't said the right thing and we start to feel fear that we've upset someone, it's very likely that this is a response that we're playing back from our earlier lives. Perhaps we got told off for speaking our minds in front of visitors or other family members. Maybe we got reprimanded at school for saying something we shouldn't in front of teachers. Or it could be that we were excluded from our friendship groups for saying something that one of the other people in the group didn't like. It's often that when we were small, these events will have had such a big impact on us that we will have thought about them for days afterwards. Hello, tendency to overthink. These events are all happening during those incredibly important informative years when we're working out who we are and what it is okay and not okay to say. The rejection that we feel when we're told off for saying something that other people don't like or don't accept can be difficult for us to shrug off or locate externally. So that will I be accepted for speaking my mind theme can run through us, sometimes lurking away until we find ourselves in an environment where we either don't feel safe or are reminded of previous situations. This is huge for our self-confidence and self-belief, and we can feel like our foundations are at least a bit rocky, if not incredibly unsteady. My invitation for you this week is to start noticing the moments where you're concerned that you might have said something wrong or weren't okay to say something. First of all, have a think about whether you did inadvertently put your foot in it, because this can happen. We can call our friend's new partner by their old partner's name. Again, that's a whole other episode. But it's most likely that you haven't. I remember my friend Steve once saying to me, if you think you've upset someone, but you can't think of what you've done, Julia, then the chances are that you haven't. And he was right. It was my response to the situation, not the reality. Once you've discarded the possibility that you shouldn't have said what you said, then start to have a think about other times in your life that this reminds you of. When did you have this response before? What was happening? And have a go at abreacting it yourself. Remind yourself that that was then, this is now, and the response that you're likely to get from stating what you think and feel is going to be very different from ones that you received years ago. As an adult, you are also in a different place as to whether you accept this too. Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet and you can find the link for this in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.